A look at the Dolphins' 2023 linebacker room with the players currently under contract and how that group stacks up against the Dolphins' opponents scheduled for this upcoming season.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Here on the Locked On Network, I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with Joe Marino. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Dolphins your first Miami Dolphins listen of the day. Today is Tuesday, June 20th, 2023. We're about a month, 5 weeks away from training camp. A couple weeks more away from Zach Thomas going into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So exciting time to be a Dolphins fan, regardless of the lull here as we get closer to the end of June. And today on the show, we're continuing our series of stacking up the Dolphins position groups against their opponents scheduled for this upcoming season. Now, we did the secondary yesterday on the show to start the week. Today, we're doing linebackers. So it's a little bit of a smaller group. You know, the secondary, you're looking at probably 5 starters, including nickels, plus primary backups at both outside corner and safety. So for a total of 7 players in the snapshot. Most teams don't roster 7 stack off-ball linebackers. So this is a little bit more of a condensed group. The Dolphins and their opponents, we're looking at the top 4 stack linebackers under contract and what that DNA means for the Dolphins. Now, there's a lot of questions about the Dolphins linebacker room and if they have enough depth and what Andrew Van Ginkel can bring to the table. And it always helps to look at the opponents across the rest of the league to better quantify and further quantify. And that's what we're going to do here today on the show. The linebacker room is fascinating for me, not just because of the Dolphins room, right? The Dolphins room has a top 4 of David Long, Jerome Baker, Duke Riley, and Channing Tindall. And if you want to include Andrew Van Ginkel in that group with him getting a little bit more of a versatile role, you could. But you have tenured players, you have new addition, you have kind of an unproven second-year player, you have a lot of athleticism. That's the stark contrast versus what this group has looked like in the past. But the linebacker room in general is a group across the league that is not romanticized quite nearly as much as some of the other positions. It's generally perceived that stack off-ball linebackers are, I don't want to say a luxury, but they're non-essential. And I can think of no better way than a couple of the opponents that we're going to cover in the course of talking about the groups that are a class below the Dolphins linebacker room to see what these other linebacker rooms look like across the NFL to further quantify that I think Miami probably has plenty. I think Miami has probably a troublesome lack of veteran depth. But I think Miami has plenty of horsepower in this capacity, especially with the trends in which the game is played now, where you see a lot of penny fronts. You see a lot of 4-2-5 nickel packages. And penny fronts is one stack linebacker on the field at the same time. And penny fronts is something that you see a number of the Fangio disciples really gravitate towards, but not all of them. And Vic has historically himself been more of a traditional 4-2-5 nickel group as compared to a, say, 5-1-5. Where the penny is the one backer is the penny. I'll be interested to know, especially when you look at the depth of what the Dolphins have up front, when you get into sub, are you going to see Vic Fangio run more penny fronts this year than he has in years past? Because the Dolphins, while they have probably a 1-2 punch at linebacker that you feel really good about in David Long and Jerome Baker, Duke Riley has been a special teams passing down type player as a depth player at linebacker. We have no clue what we have in Channing Tindall at this point. Andrew Van Ginkel's been an edge guy, and I think he'll be a hybrid player who can take some snaps off ball, but I think his best work is going to come as either a Sam or a Will. in this defense, which is capable of dropping into zone coverages and also being a pass rush threat. But if the Dolphins are going to run more penny fronts with one linebacker on the field, I feel the Dolphins have plenty to play with at off-ball linebacker. There was a team last year, the Seattle Seahawks, that only rostered 3 stack linebackers total to start the season. And it's because of the safety hybrid types and having more depth in your secondary and nickels who can tackle and safeties who can drop down and play on the second level. And look, the Dolphins have some of that too between Javon Holland and Brandon Jones and Deshaun Elliott. So I think the subplot here when we're talking about the linebacker room, and of course the top 4 that we're grading, I have David Long as a quality starter. I have Jerome Baker right now as an adequate starter, and I think there is more of a ceiling for Jerome Baker, but the limitations of the other linebackers in the linebacker room, I think, have been a hindrance to Jerome Baker playing the best version of football that he's physically capable of playing, specifically last year. And then you have Duke Riley, who I think is a quality depth player, and an incomplete evaluation in Channing Tindall. How does that stack versus the other linebacker groups on the Dolphins schedule? Well, as a reminder, we're only looking at the opponents on the schedule. So you have the AFC East, 2 games each against the Jets, the Bills, and the Patriots. You have the AFC West, which is the Chiefs, the Broncos, the Chargers, and the Raiders. You have the NFC East, which is the Eagles, the Cowboys, the Commanders, and the Giants. Then you have the 2 other second-place finishers in the North and the South, which is Baltimore and also Tennessee. And then your oddball NFC opponent was the second-place NFC South opponent, which is the Carolina Panthers. So those 14 teams plus the Dolphins, it's about half the league that's on the list that we're talking about here today on the show. And we're going to start to transition into some of those units that are going to put the Dolphins linebacker room in a pretty good perspective here in just a minute. But before we do, now is the perfect time to take the bat off the shoulder and head over to FanDuel and swing away with some bets. There's no better place to get in on all of your sports betting action than America's #1 sportsbook, FanDuel. Right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back if your first bet with FanDuel does not hit. How's that for a grand slam? So don't miss your chance to snag that no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, the official partner of Major League Baseball. Starting with the defending Super Bowl, not defending Super Bowl champions. I'm going to save them for last, actually. The defending NFC champion, Philadelphia Eagles. I have my list right here in front of me. Philadelphia, their top 4 at stack off-ball linebacker. Nakobe Dean, second-year linebacker from the University of Georgia, who played approximately 10 snaps last year. Should sound familiar for Dolphins fans as a third-round pick. Channing Tindall meet Nakobe Dean. Very different players from strengths and weaknesses perspective, yet their profiles are exactly the same. Late day 3 selection, who hardly played last year, probably going to be thrust into a more prominent role. Tindall is superior athlete. Dean is super high football IQ. Nicholas Morrow, replacement level player. Sean Bradley, replacement level player. Davion Taylor, busted third round pick. Super raw coming out of University of Colorado, had a track background, can really run. Also, in my mind, a replacement level player. So the Eagles' top 4 linebackers are 3 replacement level players and Nakobe Dean. That's not to say it's not going to be an effective group, but I certainly think you look at the depth of which Philadelphia has, and Hassan Reddick being a player who can kind of be a hybrid-type linebacker. They didn't care about this position. And they're not the only team that the Dolphins are scheduled to face this year that doesn't care about linebackers. You look at the Las Vegas Raiders, and some of the Raiders' issue is just a lack of talent and resources. Their top 4 linebackers, Robert Spillane, Divine Diablo, Darian Butler, and Luke Masterson. You've got 3 incomplete evaluations and a quality depth player. Those are your top 4 stack off-ball linebackers for the Las Vegas Raiders. Spillane kind of a primary special teams guy. He's a starting off-ball linebacker for the Raiders now. Divine Diablo was a safety at Virginia Tech, who they've converted. He's coming into year 2. Darian Butler's a second-year player. Masterson's hardly played. A whole bunch of incomplete evaluation, and you're playing in a division that has Travis Kelce, and the Raiders didn't care to address it. It doesn't mean it's a good group, but it certainly helps put the Dolphins group in better perspective. I'll continue down the list. The Washington Commanders. These were groups that in the roster grading exercise that we're doing over Locked On NFL Scouting were effectively graded as negative or net zero groups and units as a whole. Washington, they signed Cody Barton in free agency from Seattle. They let Cole Holcomb walk in free agency. They have a first-round pick in Jamin Davis, who has not lived up to his first-round pedigree, and then a couple of replacement-level players in David Mayo and Kaliki Hudson, who are really only special teams guys, but are not effective defensive players in any capacity. Cody Barton, Jamin Davis, I mean, there's some athleticism there. I think Cody Barton's an adequate level starter. At least that's a step up over the other 2 linebacker rooms that we talked about. But even the next name on this list after Washington's the New York Giants. They spent $10 million per season on Bobby Okereke. It's a good player. I think he's an adequate level starter, but I mean that's a really ugly cost of doing business to sign him for a 4-year, $40 million contract to get him in the building. Gerard Davis is another first-round pick who has pinballed around a bunch of teams, couldn't make the Detroit Lions roster last year, and Detroit had nothing at linebacker working for him other than a late day 3 rookie in Malcolm Rodriguez. I think he's a replacement-level player, and then you have a couple of young guys who were second-year players who hardly played last year to the same degree in which Channing Tindall did, and Darian Beavers and Micah McFadden. Those are your top 4 off-ball linebackers for the Giants. So there's more teams that as well who do not grade favorably in comparison to the Dolphins, one of them being Tennessee, who let David Long walk. Tennessee's group of 4 is Azeez Al-Shahir, who was signed in free agency from San Francisco. Obviously, Rand Carthon is the general manager there, who was a personnel guy with the 49ers. A lot of familiarity. He brought over Daniel Brunskill from San Francisco on the offensive line. He brought over Azeez Al-Shahir at linebacker. Monty Rice, mid-round draft selection out of Georgia, didn't play much, was hurt. Ben Neiman, career special teams guy, and a late D3 draft selection in Chance Campbell. I think that group in totality, that group of, 5 teams, is definitively a group that offers very little proven value. Now, you have some guys with some upside. You have some guys who you have expectations for. But there's a lot of incomplete resumes. There's a lot of career special teams type players. And again, that's kind of the trend in the league. Teams don't really want to pay for linebackers, and they certainly don't want to break the bank for linebackers. And I think those rooms give me a better appreciation for the David Long signing, especially because David Long came from Tennessee, one of these groups. And another one of these teams, the Giants, signed a linebacker in Bobby Okereke, who I would have been interested in signing if I were the Dolphins, but certainly not for $10 million per season. You got David Long for almost half the price. And you just got to acknowledge that he's got some hamstring issues that he intermittently deals with on seemingly an annual basis. That 5 is bottom tier for me. I think the Dolphins are probably a middle of the pack. I think there's some linebacker rooms that I think have a little bit more depth. I think there's certainly a couple linebacker rooms who have more impactful players than what Miami has assembled this year. But all of this discussion around Miami and needing an off-ball linebacker desperately, I feel pretty good about the 1 through 3, and you got a nice lottery ticket with the 4th guy. Some of these teams don't even have a 1. The next tier up for me is teams like Dallas, New England, Los Angeles, Denver, and probably Buffalo. I'd put Buffalo in that group as well, just because they lost Tremaine Edmonds. So let's start with Denver. We'll familiarize ourselves with these teams. Josie Jewell, Alex Singleton, rookie Drew Sanders, Jonas Griffith. Jewell and Singleton are low-ceiling type players. I actually think Singleton surprised me a little bit with how well he played last year. But Jewell is a little athletically limited. Singleton is a one-year sample size of meaningful. I think both of those guys are adequate level starters, however. No, I've already tipped my hand. I think David Long's a quality starter when he's available. But then you have a rookie who knows what Drew Sanders is going to be for you. He's a convert from outside linebacker who's playing stack linebacker for just the second year. And Denver has a couple of those guys who some of them still live on the edge, like Baron Browning does. So that's a group that I think has a pretty high floor, but I don't think the ceiling is particularly impressive. Dallas has Leighton Vander Esch, whose career is stabilized after some career injuries. I think he's a quality starter. But behind that is lottery ticket after lottery ticket. Would you rather have David Long, Jerome Baker, and Duke Riley as your top three, or Leighton Vander Esch, Damon Clark, who was a rookie out of LSU last year, and then DeMarvion Overshown, who was a mid-round draft pick this year as a rookie? So Vander Esch is probably the best player out of all these guys, but you go 1 through 3. Miami's in better position in my mind. New England, they've got a couple of really good box linebackers. Tavai out of Hawaii, who was drafted by Matt Patricia's Detroit Lions, and Juwan Bentley are really long, physical thumpers. New England covers themselves for the rest of it by going with a lot of safeties on the field. And then they have rookie Marte Mapu, and their third linebacker was scheduled to be Raekwon McMillan, but he's injured again. And he, at this stage, is a replacement-level player. So Tavai and Bentley are more athletically limited than David Long and Jerome Baker. I think they're both adequate-level starters with what New England does with their front. Long certainly gives you a different level of impact in coverage than any of the names that New England has right now as well. Who am I forgetting? The Chargers. Eric Kendricks coming over in free agency. I think that's a nice addition for them. Kendricks played last year in the Ed Donatel system and now playing with Brandon Staley. So there is some level of familiarity that I think sets him up favorably for success. They also drafted Dion Henley in the third round of the NFL draft. I believe it was the third round, right? Mind me, I'm talking to myself. Yes, third round. Kenneth Murray, former first-round pick at linebacker. Height, weight, speed type guy. Really physical, but from a play processing perspective, I don't think the light bulbs come on. It was a big question coming out of Oklahoma. I think the concern is that the light bulb's not going to come on, and they didn't exercise that fifth-year option. So I think Kendricks is probably a leg up on David Long from a resume and skill set perspective. Obviously, he's been as productive as a player as he's been for a very long time in the league. But then you have Kenneth Murray, who I think Jerome Baker's a better player than from an instincts and play perspective, even though Murray, I think, is a more dynamic athlete. And a rookie in Dion Henley, who's a little bit of a wild card. I think that room has some mobility to go up in these rankings when it's all said and done. But then you have the Bills, and the Bills are the first team that has a cornerstone linebacker. No linebacker room in the NFL has more than one cornerstone linebacker in Gio Marino's and I's grading of these linebacker rooms. But Buffalo having Matt Milano certainly helps. But your next three are Terrell Bernard, Dorian Williams, a rookie. Bernard was a rookie last year, and Tyrell Dotson, who's a career special teams guy. So for the conversation around, well, Miami needs a fourth linebacker, okay, what if somebody gets hurt? You got big problems. I would agree with you. But what of these groups that we've looked at, if Dallas has Leighton Vander Esch go down or Buffalo has Matt Milano go down and your three off-ball linebackers are Terrell Bernard, Dorian Williams, and Tyrell Dotson, you get a lot bigger problems than the Dolphins if one of their two linebackers go down. So again, these exercises, I'm not going to sit here and blow smoke and tell you that the Dolphins have the best position room in every group across the NFL. But I certainly hope that it changes some of the perspective and the narrative around the comfort of what Miami has, because in many places, not all places, but many places, I think this team is well positioned. Now we've acknowledged at this point a grand total of, with the Dolphins, 11 teams. I think the Dolphins are in the next tier up here. I think there's a very definitive 1-2 pecking order, and then 3 groups that are in tier 2, which would include the Miami Dolphins. And we're going to talk about those next here to close on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. I'll skip the Dolphins. We know the Dolphins group. But we have 2 linebacker rooms that I think are comparable. They are Carolina and New York with the Jets. Carolina, Shaq Thompson has been a very sturdy, quality starter for a long time. Frankie Louvu last year was a very productive player for Carolina. Now, it's a 1-year sample size. We have a scheme change, so there's a little bit of unfamiliarity on how well that's going to correlate over. But then you have Brandon Smith out of Penn State as a second-year player, and Camus Grugier-Hill, who Dolphins fans should be familiar with because he stopped in Miami and then went to Houston and is now with Carolina. I think you've got a quality starter. I think based off of last year's film, you have somebody who was a more productive player in Frankie Louvu. You have a ceiling player in Brandon Smith, and you have a quality depth piece in Grugier-Hill. I mean, that comps pretty closely in my eyes to what the Dolphins have assembled. The Jets, C.J. Mosley, Quincy Williams are your top 2. I would say this. I think C.J. Mosley last year played probably his best ball since coming to New York. I don't want to say he justified the salary that he's at because he's a top-of-market linebacker salary. But I thought he was a quality starter. I think he's a more complete player than David Long. And then Quincy Williams is really explosive, still a little undisciplined, still a little bit of a wild stallion at times at linebacker. But I think he's more explosive than Jerome Baker. And I think some of Jerome's best stuff has come in rush situations where I think Quincy Williams and his range as a sideline-to-sideline defender and his hitting power, I think, is a little bit of a leg up. So I think there's some comparableness there. Now, I will say this. I think the Jets 1 and 2 is more impactful. But I think the 3 and the 4 go in the Dolphins' favor because you have Hamza Nasser-Ladin, who's a safety convert from Florida State, and you have Jamian Sherwood, who's a safety convert from Auburn. And those are linebackers 3 and 4 for the Jets. So I would say the Dolphins have the deeper room where the Jets have a little bit more of a top-heavy room. And I think the Panthers have a similarly well-rounded room to what the Dolphins have. I think those 3 are kind of bunched together. As far as you want to quantify how good the best players are, say like Buffalo with Matt Milano, and you try your best to weigh that out versus his impact on the room versus the 4th linebacker's impact on the room. And that's why I think, teams like New York and Buffalo are a little bit more top-heavy in their linebacker rooms. I think Miami has quality and adequate at the top, but they also have a modest amount of depth. They don't, however, I think match up to the top 2 names on this list, which are the last 2 opponents that the Dolphins are scheduled to face, starting first with the Baltimore Ravens, trading for Roquan Smith, giving him a $20 million per year contract to go with Patrick Queen as a former first-round pick. They have Malik Harrison, who I think is a really likable young player in this room. But Roquan is a cornerstone player who, there was some interest at this time last year and a little bit later in the calendar year. Should Miami go out and get this guy? Should Miami go out and get this guy? And it's kind of a nice reminder. I know that I said no at the time because going out and getting a stack off-ball linebacker and paying him $20 million per season with the trajectory of where the Dolphins were going, a little bit of risky business, especially when you consider that the linebacker roles in a Brian Flores defense and Josh Boyer defense was a little redundant. And the argument was, I don't think Roquan Smith is enough of an upgrade over Jerome Baker for you to justify sending premier assets to go get that player and pay that player that contract. Now, the cruel irony, of course, is if you knew that Vic Fangio was coming in year 2, you'd probably be a little bit more inclined to say, hey, maybe we make that work. Now, the Dolphins, I think, ended up just fine. They bought at the trade deadline and got Bradley Chubb. They drafted Cam Smith. They have the linebackers that they have. They got David Long for a quarter of the price, almost, of Roquan Smith, and didn't have to send any assets to bring him in. But that's kind of a fun storyline to look back on because Roquan Smith his presence is in that of a room which ranks better than the Dolphins. And I would say he is, yes, a better player than Jerome Baker, and I never questioned that. But the question was, is he enough of an upgrade in the role in which Miami needs him to fulfill to justify the contract? And we'll see how that plays out for Baltimore. You know, they may end up not keeping Patrick Queen as a result of that now too. But then they have Trenton Simpson in the third round as their fourth linebacker, So you've got Roquan and Patrick Queen with a cornerstone player. I think that's a leg up over what the Dolphins have. They have a quality depth player, Malik Harrison, and then they have Trenton Simpson as kind of the incomplete evaluation player. So I just think the top of that room probably separates it from Miami. Kansas City is the other team, and Kansas City's here because they've got the deepest 1 through 4 of any team, either that the Dolphins themselves have assembled or the teams that the Dolphins are scheduled to play. Nick Bolton, quality starter. They've used 3 day 2 picks in the last 3 years on linebackers. Nick Bolton, Willie Gay, and Leo Chenal. And then they signed Drew Tranquill, who for my money would have been a great addition for the Dolphins. Probably expected him to be in the price range that David Long got as compared to David Long. But Drew Tranquill only got a 1-year deal worth a couple $1 million. So I think the league kind of threw some flags out there. I don't know if that's medical related or what with Drew Tranquill. But if you told me Nick Bolton, Drew Tranquill, Willie Gay, and Leo Chenal, that's a heck of a group. And Chenal's kind of in the same boat as Tyndall, where he's mid-third round pick or late third-round pick. Didn't really play last year. We don't really know what we had. He played like 200 snaps. It's more than Channing played. But Willie Gay, I think, is a fine linebacker. But I think you have 2 quality starters in Nick Bolton and Drew Tranquill. So that's a pretty vast palette of outcomes that we've painted here. You have the Chiefs with 3 adequate starters or better, plus an incomplete evaluation for a guy who was a third-round pick last year. And then you have Philadelphia, who has a third-round pick last year and a bunch of replacement-level players. So on the spectrum of NFL outcomes with linebacker rooms this year, just in the 1 through 4, I think Miami's in the top third. Now, health and durability is going to be a variable, but it is for all of these teams, and I do think Miami probably benefits from having another contender to come into this roster and be a quality depth option, but I don't think they have to force anything at linebacker specifically, especially with how many safeties are playing and these big nickel sub-package groups across the NFL these days. That is our latest here on Locked On Dolphins. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the show. Make sure you keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins because it is your team every day. Here on the Locked On Network, I'm Kyle Krabs. I am out of here. Fins up. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. We'll be back tomorrow with Power to the Pot, our mailbag for the week.